anticipate about 40 minutes of presentation. And I could do that while you're reading, or if you would prefer to wait and eat a little bit and then have the presentation, what doesn't matter to me.
Well, did you get a chance to eat?
Huh?
Did you get a chance to eat?
Don't worry about that.
Actually, I make it wait.
I would prefer to do it while.
This is for the kids, maybe.
You prefer to do it while we're reading?
Yeah, dinner theater.
I'm sorry?
It's like dinner theater.
Yes, yeah, more or less. Can you see our information?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right, well, then I'll go ahead with the presentation. Gary's gonna cover that for me.
I don't care really
Yeah,
one way or
Gary's
the
gonna
other.
catch it. Gary's gonna be my catcher. Okay, then. I will get started here.
Actually, well, we just put it down here.
How would you explain it? Like a sideshow kind of?
We just put it down here on the table.
Okay, so the term, I'm going to stand in front of you, Stephen.
Okay.
Are you sure you can see where it's at? Okay. Icon is literally a Greek word that means likeness, picture, image. We tend to think of icons as being painted on a flat panel, but an icon can also be a statue. And believe it or not, there's never been a prohibition to statuary in the Orthodox Church. It's not common in the Orthodox Church, but it's not prohibited either. And so we have, in the Western Church, of course, more often, we have the statuary than we do in the Eastern Church. There's the question, what constitutes religious art? And what specifically makes something an icon? And of course, it's like anything, people can argue about what constitutes the legitimate forms of religious art. We have our own particular perspective in the Orthodox Church, but there is a wide variety of different approaches that people use when it comes to the idea of what really is. Probably some of the more common forms of religious art would be something like this. Kind of a familiar image of Jesus, you know, the long hair, beard, and so on. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course. But it's not what would be considered an icon in the Orthodox tradition. And I'll explain why a little bit more. But just right now, this is a variety of different forms of art that comes under the general category of religious art. And, be very modern. That still carries the image, you know it's Jesus. Of course, one of the things that one finds oftentimes is depicting Jesus in a variety of ethnic positions, ethnic faces. Jesus here is a Oriental, and John, the Apostle John, asleep next to him at the Last Supper. That's what's being depicted here. It raises the question, you know, how much can you change the image of Jesus and still have Jesus? And the question, of course, gets to be fairly significant question when you start to play around with modern styles and modern techniques. Is it still Jesus? That's a good question. What do you think?
What's the thing with the hand?
Yeah, he's,
Oh, like bless you or something?
yeah. You know, that's one of the positions that Jesus' hand is in sometimes, is in this mode, and that's a teaching mode. And we see icons, Orthodox icons with Jesus at his hand.
But that's
Yeah,
like
he's
backwards
teaching.
to that one.
He's what?
But it's not,
It's backwards to it.
I may have turned it backwards. I probably did.
no, the
No, it's
image is facing himself, not out.
Yeah, it's the way the hand faces.
Well, in any event, I find I have trouble seeing this as Jesus. I don't know about you.
This is Dolly, right?
I'm sorry?
This is Salvador Dali.
It looks like Dolly. I'm not sure if it's Dolly or not.
I think
It looks like Dolly.
the one where the cross is appears to be floating in the sky, I think, is more traditional. I mean, in the appearance of Christ rather than the floating cross itself.
This is our more familiar image. Of course. Now let's look at that for a minute. We know it's Jesus, of course, for a number of reasons. But it's traditional also to put labels on icons. And so we've got in the upper left-hand corner what looks like an I and a C. This is actually Byzantine script. And in the Byzantine script, that's an iota and a sigma for Jesus. And on the other side, the Byzantine script for Christ. And where I see it, Pantocrator, ruler of the cosmos. That's the letters on the other side of the shoulder.
And
Pantocrator, the ruler of the cosmos. Jesus has his fingers in a particular position, and if you look at that and think about that a minute, he has 3 fingers raised and 2 fingers together. The 3 fingers symbolizing the Trinity, and the 2 fingers together, the nature, 2 natures of Christ. In his hand, in the other hand, he holds the book. The book is closed. That means it's the book of life. And it's closed because God knows who is in the book of life and who isn't. This is prior to judgment. The halo has 3 letters there. It's actually two words. Ho, hon. In English, I am. Remember what God said to Moses in the burning bush? Moses said, "Who shall I say sent me?" And God replied, "What? I am the one. I am the one that is." And so that's echoed in the halo. Ochon, I am the one. What else can I say? The blue represents the natural world, the sky, the sea, things of that sort. Red represents divinity. Christ's divinity was cloaked in his humanity when he took on human flesh. Well, that's most of the symbolism. Any questions on that? This next one, I think, will look somewhat familiar if you think about this one.
If you want to get coffee now.
Look at that for a minute and see if there's something familiar about that.
Yep. Only where I've seen that before.
Have you seen this before?
I haven't.
Well, I haven't been to Spain, but I think I've seen someone that's.
You mean that particular one or that's imitating it?
Take a look at that and then take a look at the icon over there.
Celeste, you want some?
I've never seen Jesus
Celeste,
beard and mustache.
Celeste, you want some more soup?
I said I've never seen him pictured
Thank
with
you.
beard and mustache like that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Yeah, that's
it's
an
interesting.
that is considered to be one of the best Romanesque paintings in existence. That's from Spain, the city of Tahol.
What period of time?
Time, oh gosh, let's see. Around 1100. Around there. Yeah. And that was the inspiration, of course, for the icon here. And you look at this and you look at the one that's over the altar and you see how I borrowed that imagery for the icon on the altar.
It's actually reversed.
Have I got it back? Oh, I do.
Backwards.
I do have it backwards. Down to the Latin on the book.
There you go.
There you go. There you go, soon.
Ego in me, lux mundi. I'm the light of the world. So, in Orthodox tradition, in the Western Rite, we consider all of the things that were done up through the Romanesque period to have legitimacy as icons. After the Romanesque period, Romanesque period, it begins to get decadent. And so we don't generally consider the art after that era to be legitimate for iconography in the Western Rite parish.
In the
That doesn't
West.
mean you won't see it, but,
You mean in the West or in both West and East?
oh, both West and East, yeah. But in the East, they wouldn't use Romanesque, they'd use Byzantine, Russian, the various other forms.
So what Father David was saying is the first one was with Augustine, 538. Is that what you said?
586.
Oh, 586.
It wasn't the first
But
one.
not the first.
Not that it shows this part of our Western heritage as well, and it's not something you borrow.
Are exceptions determined on a case-by-case basis?
Yeah, they're somewhat determined by what local priests sometimes decide to do. And if the bishop comes and doesn't like it, he can say he wants it removed. But you'll find that there are some parishes where they'll have things that are much later. And technically that's not really correct, but some priests are not as attuned to being politically correct, I guess.
There was this, I was watching this documentary on what used to be a French Roman Catholic convent has now become an Orthodox monastery.
Mm-hmm.
And they've, from what I could tell, they continue to be respectful of the statuary and iconography that had been left behind after the last nuns died. And even so was that determined by their bishop at that
The
location?
bishop would have the say on that eventually. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, the bishop has the say on what is allowed and what isn't. It comes down to it.
So you're saying
And
that
he
after
works-
1100, whatever was painted after 1100 is not considered iconography, it's
11,
considered
12, somewhere in
art?
that neighborhood. I mean, the dating gets fuzzy because the Renaissance starts in Italy and moves through Europe, you know, and the Gothic area is kind of the same thing. So what's Romanesque at one point is not necessarily at another point. It's fuzzy, you know. It isn't that people, one day some guy looked out the window and said, "Oh, look, Marge, the Renaissance is here," you know.
So
So
it's
you
stuff
get-
that was commissioned by the popes, like Michelangelo's stuff, that's not,
It generally wouldn't be, yeah.
it's not iconography, it's art.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
So I've seen Pieta's gorgeous,
The pit.
Oh, I mean, yeah,
and I mean, I grew up with that. So
Yeah.
that's hard.
yeah.
It's difficult for me because I like them both.
But the Pieta, while not an icon, it wouldn't be considered decadent in that instant, would it?
Say that again?
Michelangelo's Pieta, would that be considered decadent?
Yeah. Yes.
That disturbs me. I'm sorry.
That doesn't say it isn't a nice piece of art. It is. It's not to say it doesn't have some spiritual content. It does. But it's not something that we would have in an Orthodox church.
It's hard when you grew up with that.
If in the event Rome were to ever return to Orthodoxy, how would that be handled?
Haven't a clue. I haven't a clue. Okay, so this is in Florence. And one of the things that I think is interesting about this, there's a Byzantine influence in this particular piece. There were Byzantine artists that came from the East and settled in the West and sometimes had a fairly strong impact on the art of the West in some situations. And this is an interesting one. But also one of the things that is interesting is the German influence that begins to develop in Western Christianity period. An interesting book a few years ago was called The Germanization of Western Christianity. And you notice Jesus is essentially blonde here.
You mean they Aryanized him?
Well, that term has that's a loaded term, so you have to be careful how that's used. But certainly the more Nordic, I prefer Nordic, I think, more Nordic kind of influence.
Why is his hand backwards?
Yeah,
Like
you
it's
know,
stuck on wrong.
I mean, the hands and the feet are really kind of grotesque.
Yeah, they are.
But it's a yeah, well, what
I
can
mean,
I
but
say?
his hand's totally backwards.
Yeah,
He's got two left hands.
yeah, it does. This is in baptistry. And it's a mosaic in the
I
ceiling.
think you just brought one over
And
here.
this is the whole ceiling.
Here, finish it.
Wow.
It's quite a thing to walk in there and it's kind of like walking to the Greek Orthodox Cathedral in Denver, only more so.
These are all pictures from the West somewhere?
Yeah, this is all Western stuff. Right now, that's what I'm focusing on. And
little
To
cherubim.
illustrate the point in terms of what's considered decadent and what isn't.
So that's decadent, huh?
Yeah,
I'm going to cry.
Although the word decadent itself might be a bit misleading.
Would you define
well, you
that?
know, it's a, I think a
Oh,
term
Dad,
they
you're
use
so
somewhat tongue in cheek.
cute. Oh, the baby.
Somewhat tongue in cheek.
But would you define it for your younger audience here?
Okay. It is worldly in a bad sense.
Does that make sense to you?
I'm having problems with this.
Let me talk about this a little bit.
It's called decadent.
The what we've got here is a young woman in a nice Italian. This is Raphael, the painter,
I love Raphael.
and Raphael, of course, is a marvelous Renaissance painter.
And he did a wonderful baby.
Yeah, you know.
The gift.
This is this cute
God's
little,
gift.
cute little Italian bambino,
Oh,
you know, and Raphael's mistress posing for the Madonna, and it's very, it's very this world. It's the world that Raphael lived in. It
similar
has
to the world we live in now.
a commercial value to Raphael. Was interested in things commercially, and. It's not going to say it's this world. There's nothing mystical about it. Now you can try to read something mystical into it if you want to, but it really isn't. It is really what Renaissance painting was about. Because Renaissance painting was about the real world, the world that was for them modern. It was about freeing themselves from the constraints of the church and all kinds of other things. It was about reflecting things that were very much this world. And the focus really was, we're in a modern world now, and we're live a modern way, and the old ways are really
Which is ironic, really, when you consider that many of them were trying to recapture the classic Greco-Roman world.
Well, there was a time, I mean, the word Renaissance itself is designed to, is a word to mean finding the pagan world is essentially what it was. It was an attempt to reinstitute pagan themes. I've got, and I don't know that I brought it with me now. I don't think I did. Yes, I did. Okay. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. But let's take a look at this one. What we've got right. Get this down a little lower for a second. Let's focus on this. You see the window here? We're looking out. We're looking out into the natural world. And seeing into the distance. This is the point where they began to explore and discover uses for three-point perspective.
Yes.
Of course, the world knew about that in previous times. The Romans and the Greeks were quite good at doing realistic painting when they wanted to. The fool the eye kinds of things that you find in some of the pre-Christian Roman paintings, for example. But a lot of that technology got lost or was of no particular value. But
Value,
here's,
the word value is something that
yeah,
helped get that dimension.
yeah, the distance here is
Like
being
that.
featured. Because, you know, you're looking out that window and you're seeing way back into the countryside. And it's the natural world, and it's a celebration of the natural world.
That
and
was
it's
quite exciting to be able to do that.
things said in this context. So it's the Annunciation, of course. Gabriel is telling Mary that she is going to bear the Christ child. And it's a nice painting. But the focus is this world. Now, let's move to this one. I'm going to keep this one back. One of my favorite painters is Botticelli. And Botticelli's women are some of the most beautiful women that you could imagine in terms of his ability to paint.
This is my mother's art.
Gorgeous women. He's quite good at it. This is Venus arising out of the waves, sometimes referred to as Venus on the half shell. Botticelli's Venus is exactly the same face that Botticelli puts on the Virgin Mary. You put together a picture painted by Botticelli of the Virgin Mary and Venus, and you'll find that it's the same model and it looks the same. So where's the sacredness? Botticelli wasn't interested in that. He could just as readily paint a painting of Venus as the Virgin Mary and not bat an eye. Okay, now here's one of the things about Orthodox iconography. People who paint Orthodox icons are committed to a certain spiritual discipline and a certain spiritual character. And to paint a pagan image and the Virgin Mary as the same face would be unthinkable for an Orthodox iconographer. And I think the reason for that should be obvious, but in case it isn't,
Maybe
They,
she repented.
it does not show the proper honor to the Virgin Mary if you're going to use the same face in a pagan painting. When we paint icons, and I've been painting icons for 30 years or more, when we paint icons, we paint them as an act of prayer.
And that's what I've always heard in the Roman church too.
Yeah, it's an act of devotion, and you don't do it lightly, and you don't do it frivolously. You know, it's every one of the icons in here has been painted as a prayer.
It was supposed to be. Well,
Yeah.
I've always was under the impression.
Yeah, right. So that's one of the things that makes a difference between the beautiful Renaissance art. It is beautiful, but it's not
Who's the woman that made
it's not
what kind of
Orthodox
person?
iconography.
Jesus,
This is a beautiful painting,
she's kind of naughty woman.
but the focus is not the spiritual world. The focus is the physical world. And now, having looked at this again for just a minute, let's take a look at
Father?
Annunciation
Are you
Orthodox and
are you suggesting there might be an element of neo-pagan protest in this painting?
I'm sorry, what?
Are you suggesting there might be a subtle element of neo-pagan protest in this painting?
Yeah, say that again. I guess I didn't get that.
Are you suggesting there's an element of protesting the spiritual in this painting?
Oh, I think there sometimes is, but I think it's less that and more indifference. I think they were largely indifferent.
Indifferent.
Putting your background was,
Well, I think there was to some
you didn't
extent.
know how to do that very well. Dimension.
I think it probably depended on the artist. Okay, now, let's look at that. That is obviously not the natural world. And you can say that for several reasons. Now, there's a lot to be seen in this icon. First of all, the angel is not standing on the ground as you look at that. This is not intended to be a snapshot of what actually took place when the angel Gabriel came to Mary. This is a spiritual rendition, if you will, of the event. And so there's a surrealistic dimension to this. It is deliberately not natural. And the angel is deliberately kind of floating in air there. Mary, let's talk about Mary for just a minute. You see, Mary is traditionally in the Eastern tradition. In Western tradition, we get Mary a lot of times in blue. But in the Eastern tradition, Mary generally has a red outer garment and a blue inner garment. It's the reverse of Jesus. That's because Mary's humanity, the blue, was encompassed by God's presence so that she could conceive the Christ child. So the red represents God's encompassing her to, for her to give birth to the incarnation. You can barely make it out. There are 3 stars, one on each shoulder and one on her forehead. Those have to do with her virginity. Virgin before, during, and after. I heard somebody say a while back that it's inappropriate to make too big a fuss over gynecological issues with the Very Blessed Mother of God, and I think that's probably true. But I think that there's a certain symbolism that there's a value in maintaining things. Okay, now let's, the buildings. Take a look at the buildings for a minute. Obviously, it's very different from what you saw when you looked in that early Renaissance painting, where the perspective went through the window and things were natural and everything lined up. If you look here at the buildings and look at the lines of perspective, you can see that they go wonky. And that's deliberate. If you were to follow those lines, not going back, because they spread, unlike the lines of natural perspective, which come together, in the distance. They spread going back, but they come together in the forefront, so that you're creating spiritual space with the vanishing point behind the viewer of the icon. And in other words, the icon reaches out to encompass the viewer. You see what I'm saying? Do you follow me? That reverse perspective is deliberate, and it's found quite commonly in Orthodox iconography. You can also see it in the icon of the birth of Christ over the door to the Lady Chapel. I used that manner of perspective when I painted that. The focus is not the natural world. Icons are not meant to show us this world. Icons are meant to show us the world beyond this world. They're sometimes referred to as windows in heaven. They are a means of connecting us with God and the saints and the angels and that world that we don't see readily as we walk around and do our day-to-day activities and things. But we know it's real. And it's the world that we come in contact with in the sacraments. When we receive communion, we are receiving God's presence out of that world. And someday, as indicated in the icon over the entryway, someday we will leave this world and enter into that world. So icons remind us of that. Icons give us a glimpse of that world. They are a means by which we create spiritual space, so that as we're surrounded by the icons in this worship space, as you always are in Orthodox churches, it's unthinkable to have an Orthodox church without icons. As you are surrounded by these, you are surrounded by a spiritual energy, a spiritual force, a spiritual presence. Because the figures in these icons are more than just a representation. They're a linkage. They are a supernatural kind of tie-in to that other world. And it's a reminder to us, first of all, that there is another world. A reminder that that world is inhabited by those that have gone before us with heroic spiritual strength and energies. And that that world is not oblivious to us. That world is concerned with us. We ask their prayers, they pray for us. You know, prayer is something that is something powerful, mysterious, mystic, and icons are literally prayer and paint. They are things that bind us
Well,
to that world.
I've always appreciated the art of an ancient Orthodox and the Roman art. Is at the time, then art is a reflection of man, and it is a teaching tool. There were so many people that were illiterate, and then I think sometimes they didn't really, they're not the intellectual. They had to work a lot on the artwork around that. Perhaps the molding of the three-dimensional and the perspective. It took a while to get perspective in through the centuries, and then when they got a hold of that, it helped people to understand, and then it was the opportunity for, in my mind, a shame that we couldn't have combined the two, the spirituality and the beautiful Orthodox, like your beautiful paintings that you have in this church. Why we couldn't embrace both of them, I have a problem with that.
Well, the reason is that we've got that world out there, and we have very precious little of this world here. And when you start bringing them together, you lose the spiritual energy that.
Well, I don't. You know, I've growing up a Roman Catholic, and seen beautiful artwork, both paintings and my home was full of artwork. We had Gothic pictures, and we embraced all of it. And I felt tremendous spiritual feelings when I've seen the more modern, the more molding of the figure, the more dimension. I have felt very,
I'm sure you have.
very spiritual there, and it is disappointing that that like, okay, they're all women of the street that they took pictures, you know, they painted, that is sad. But I think that maybe is through history, and even the painters. How do we know that they were? It's supposed to be prayer, but a lot of people, you know, might have taken a person who has changed. Maybe they have been a woman of the street or a man of the street or whatever, and they changed, and they became. Well, I mean, Jesus was even embraced people that were women, particularly, that were, you know, not. So I'm having an issue with that.
Okay. That's fine. You can have an issue with it.
That's one thing. They often say that the iconographer does not paint a picture, he writes a picture. Because each little thing, like the color, certain colors, certain way everything is, it has a meaning.
Exactly.
The drape over the...
Yeah, I didn't mention the drape.
Exactly. It tells a story. They were illiterate, and so they
It's
learned
used
that
for
way.
teaching.
So often people were illiterate.
The drapery between the buildings is an indication that the thing that's being depicted is something that took place inside a building, but is such a fantastic and phenomenal event that it can't be encompassed within four walls. So it's shown outside.
And
It again speaks to the spiritual power of this event.
What?
the
Would-
significance of the dial, or is that like a star? Is that a sign?
That's
Is that- what is that?
God's grace.
Okay,
That's the energies and grace of God.
okay.
Was there a more? I think the more important question is: was there a more responsible way to balance traditional iconography with the new forms of art?
There are some iconographers that are doing some interesting things that are a little more modern. The Romanians have done some interesting things in that vein. The difficulty always is you start to lose the integrity.
I get to thinking of the icons that were clearly influenced by the Shroud of Turin, which they now know was originally a Byzantine relic. And some people call it, I like to think of it as the first icon that Jesus himself made during the resurrection. And you can always tell the icons that, because the ones that seem to have almost a lazy eye, those are almost always directly inspired by the shroud. They don't bleed. And
Yeah, I think the shroud certainly has had an impact very early in terms of kind of standardizing more or less, because I'm inclined to think that there may be some validity to the arguments about the shroud. I don't know.
it
It
almost,
certainly is very, very ancient.
well, it almost certainly hung in the Hagia Sophia until it was stolen in 1204.
Yeah, there's no question about that. And it was folded generally, so you just saw the face. So, well, I think that's as far as we've got time to go tonight. So I think I will call it quits with this.